Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southgate.
And I'm Albert Berg, and the bad idea that we're talking about today is taxes.
I mean, that's always a bad idea.
Rejoice, libertarians. No, a very specific kind of tax on a very specific item. In France, Tony, we're talking about the Gabelle. And I did look up several pronunciations that had the hard G. My gut tells me that since it's French, it should be Gabelle. But I'm not French, so I went with the pronunciation guides that I looked up. The Gabelle was a tax on salt, most famously in France. There are other taxes on salt around the world, Tony, but the worst one, and the one we're talking about today, was in France. And it began way back in the day, back before France was even really a thing as like a country.
So it was more like a feudal state at that time?
Something like that. There were various regions that had various lords over them. And in one of these regions, the king created this salt tax in 1259 to raise money for a war that he was fighting. And you know how taxes are, Tony. They start out small, and they tell you they're going to be temporary. And neither one of those things is ever true.
Yes.
This tax...
It just always grows.
The government had the money rolling in, and they said, hey, the war's over, but let's keep the money rolling in. That's pretty great. And also, let's charge a little bit more, because we could use some more money. And as France grew, the tax grew until, by the time of Louis XIV, it was estimated to be the state's largest source of revenue. A tax on salt. And the problems with this tax were many. To start with, it was the kind of tax that is called a poll tax, Tony. A poll tax is a tax that essentially hits all people everywhere with exactly the same amount of tax. And it's the opposite of what you might think of as a progressive tax, where rich people have to pay more. If everybody pays the same amount, if you tax everybody $1 in the United States, some people are going to feel that loss of $1 more than others. I mean, $1 is a bad example, but you can raise it to any amount. If there's a single amount tax that everybody has to pay, the people who are poor are going to resent the fact that the rich people don't have to pay as large a percent of their income.
Yeah.
There was also the fact that as this tax went on, rich people didn't end up having to pay it anyway, or paid a smaller amount than the poor people. But in theory, let's argue everybody pays the same amount of tax, Tony. It's quote unquote fair. Everybody buys salt, everybody uses about the same amount of salt. So this is a fair system. All men are paying the same amount, right?
Yeah.
No. See,
okay.
Despite the fact that they said everybody was going to pay the same amount, they didn't, because the different regions of France were taxed at different rates. And this was partly because the gradual unification of France meant that local tax rates were sort of absorbed into the whole. So as the central country that began to take over other countries that eventually became France, as they were incorporating these various regions into themselves, they said, listen, we know that you don't probably want to be part of us. You'd like your independence. We're taking over. But as a concession, you can keep the lower tax rate that you have on this salt thing, because it was popular enough that various regions were adopting it, and they didn't force everybody to pay the same amount. The other factor here was that, practically speaking, if you lived in a salt-producing area, it didn't make sense for the government to tax you at a high rate because you had the salt right there. The smuggling problem that they would eventually deal with to other regions would have been even more difficult to deal with if they were trying to tax people who had the salt already at their disposal for the salt that they were mining.
So, well, that's okay. If you don't want to pay the tax, you could go on a low-sodium diet, right?
You'd think that, Tony. You think like, well, maybe salt, I don't have to deal with it as much. I don't have to have salt in my diet, at least not in high levels. I'll just eat unsalted potato chips. It's fine. They're terrible. I'm a French person that knows about potato chips. However, there's another complication called the salt duty. There's a fancy French word for it, Tony. I didn't write that down because I'm not French. But this was a French law that mandated that everyone above the age of 8, especially in these higher taxed regions of the country, buy a minimum ration of 15.5 pounds of salt every year. And the taxes on this 15 pounds of salt amounted to a month's income for many poor families.
Ouch.
Super ouch. The reason that they did this, and this was actually something I had a difficulty wrapping my mind around because I read about this required salt buy. And I thought, why would you require... This seems like just throwing salt in the wound of this already high tax that you just require people to buy them. The government's rationale was people are smuggling this salt, and we'll get into the smuggling operations here in a second, but people are going to be incentivized to smuggle this salt. But if we force people to buy more salt than they could possibly eat, then they will have no incentive to buy it from the smugglers.
I mean, it's clever in a very, very tyrannical way. I get what they're going for.
If that wasn't enough, Tony, you'd think, okay, I've been forced to buy all this salt. This sucks. I do have so much salt that I cannot use it all. But, you know, this is back before refrigeration. Maybe I can take this salt and I can use it to preserve some stuff. You've got salted meat back in the day. Salt pork, that was a thing. That takes a lot of salt. Surely this is an outlet for my salt that the government has forced me to buy. I can use this 15 pounds of salt that I have spent a month's salary on to preserve my food. But no, you could not do that because the French government wanted you to buy the salt that you were going to salt your food with, Tony. Because if you use the salt that they forced you to buy to salt your food, see, that would mean that you wouldn't be buying it from them and paying taxes on salt that they wanted taxes on.
Yeah, so you gotta buy that salt, but just keep that 15 pounds of salt so you could make like a statue of Lot's wife or something.
I suppose. There were many tiny infractions involving the use of salt that incurred heavy penalties to the point where shepherds grazing their sheep and the sheep drinking out of a pond that was salty was considered an infraction of these Gabelle salt laws. As France grew, the inequality of these regions grew to the point where there were 5 different regions of taxation in France. There were some regions where people had to pay no tax. That was a sweetening deal. They were brought in late in the game and they didn't want to pay the tax, and the French were like, you guys can... We're going to conquer you, but, you know, just so you don't have an uprising, and there were a lot of uprisings around this Gabelle stuff, we're going to let you not pay the tax. And then in other regions, ranging from a gradient up and down, but the highest taxed region paid 20 times as much for their salt as the region that didn't have any tax at all.
That is
and sometimes
ridiculous. That is so much more.
And, of course... because you have these two regions, sometimes they were separated by a single border, Tony. You can imagine that the incentive to go down to your grocery store if you live in a region that has no tax on the salt and go take it across the border and sell it for, you know, the low price of only 15 times as much as what you paid for it to the inhabitants of the high tax region, that you could make yourself a tidy profit.
Yeah, that's pretty solid. Just right out the gate making like 1,500%.
Obviously, the government doesn't want this. They want to make their money, Tony. And so salt smuggling became eventually something that was punishable by death. And when that wasn't enough to stop people who were willing to risk death to make 15 times as much as what they had invested, they expanded this punishment to anybody who happened to be housing a salt smuggler.
So, like, an entire family could get killed if you got caught smuggling salt.
My impression of when I was reading this was sort of about, like, innkeepers and things.
Oh,
that it would sort of disincentivize housing people along the road as they were carrying salt. But also my impression of this was they wouldn't, like, check to see if you knew that the person was smuggling salt or really even, there wasn't a lot of due process involved in any of this, which brings us to our next problem with this salt tax, the gabelles. Gabelles. I don't know how to pronounce any of these French things, Tony. Gabelles. These are what we're going to call them, the salt cops. And despite the fact that they are charged with enforcing these laws, they aren't directly government employees. They have like a ton of leeway to essentially do whatever they want to do. And this extended as well to the enforcement of this salt tax. A lot of times, and this was pretty common with taxation, back in earlier history, rather than the government having an entire operation where they would directly collect the tax, they would have agents in between that essentially you would pay the government a significant chunk of money for the right to collect the tax for yourself. So the government would get the money from you, and then you would take the money from the people to reimburse yourself, plus a little more. Obviously, you're not gonna operate at cost, Tony.
Yeah.
You're gonna squeeze out as much as you can to make a profit in this tax collecting enterprise.
Always.
And so the gabelles are these guys who work in this sort of middleman area where they're the enforcers hired by these people who have been hired by the government to collect the tax, or rather who have paid the government for the privilege to collect the tax. And they were able to stop people, search them, arrest them, essentially without impunity. And naturally, because these are dudes, a lot of their favorite targets were women, whom they would, quote unquote, search as thoroughly and invasively as they pleased. And the thing was, those searches weren't always fruitless, because women were often guilty of smuggling salt, hidden in various unmentionable areas, including some women who built fake derrieres to hold their salt cargo. Women walking around with giant fake butts that they had stuffed full of salt to smuggle across the border.
So it looks like a Kardashian, but feels like rock salt.
Exactly. See, that's the thing. See, in that 40-Year-Old Virgin movie where he talks about boobs feeling like bags of sand, he's actually an immortal who used to live in, 15th century France, and his only experience with boobs was when he interacted with a woman who had been smuggling salt.
I mean, it makes so much more sense. Maybe he was one of the Gabelles.
Yeah, fun fact. Smugglers would also stage fake funerals where the coffins were filled with salt. They would bake loaves of bread consisting of nothing but a thin crust of bread surrounding a salt core. There were dogs who were trained to carry salt in specially built jackets. And the book that I read about this, describing the training of these dogs, it was so sad because they would take the dog to a house and they would treat him super good. They give him nice food. They treat him nice. Like the one owner of the house would treat him good. And then they would have people come in and just kick the crap out of the dog and treat him like garbage so that the dog would only trust the owner. He would distrust everybody else except for his owner that treated him right. And then they would take him and put him in a different region, like have him give him training on how to get home, and eventually he gets good at this, and then they strap these jackets full of salt to the dog so that he can sneak across the border and bring salt to his owner, who then sells it at a sick profit, Tony.
That's pretty elaborate, but I guess if they catch the dog, that's a little bit better than like death to you and the innkeeper.
Right, how are they going to know whose dog it is? They don't know, it's a dog. My favorite method, the most ingenious one, was if you wanted to ship a lot of salt somewhere. See, the authorities had their eyes on the rivers. They knew that people were trying to do this, and the best way, obviously, to ship a lot of stuff around would be in a boat. So you couldn't just hide your salt like in amongst some other goods. What the salt smugglers would do is they would put their contraband salt in among the barrels of regular taxed salt that was being shipped down the river. And the guards, if they did not perform like a specific accurate count every time they came on board, you could really just slide quite a bit past them.
I mean, they're looking at it like it's not like they had weigh stations.
You say that, but as the smuggling methods became more elaborate, so too did the government's attempts to stop this, there were specially issued bags that were only allowed to be used for salt. And when people started figuring out that if the bag ripped and you sewed it back up and it got a little bigger, you could put in more than what the government said you could, and so you could smuggle salt that way, they started mandating that they could not be ripped. There was a lot of head counts and specific stuff that had to be done to try to quench this flow of salt, and it just never really worked. It just led to a lot of feelings of inequality and injustice. And you got to understand too that the people who lived in the regions where they could smuggle the salt, they didn't feel like they were really committing a crime because everybody was doing it. It would be kind of like, I would say it's similar to how smoking pot is seen today, where even in places where it's illegal, it's not bad illegal.
Yeah, it's you've got to, some states are worse, but you'd have to have multiple pounds of it before you're in any major legal trouble.
Right. And then to sort of twist the analogy, it's as if pot was something that literally everybody used to cook with all the time.
Yeah, that'd be a different society.
You can imagine that people didn't really take the law very seriously and really resented this draconian enforcement of the law. And so in 1789, the French people finally had enough. Now, we're talking about the French Revolution here. A lot of causes of the French Revolution, but the Gabelle was a very central sort of rallying cry. It was a big thing that people could point to and say, this sucks. We want this to be done with. We're sick of being groped by lecherous salt cops because we're trying to make a buck off of your stupid salt tax. So it was one of the straws on the camel's back. Let's put it that way.
I could definitely see that. Anytime you have that taxation without, I don't want to pull the American Revolution taxation without representation thing, people are going to be pretty sour about that. Or rather salty about that.
This was also before sort of the invention of economics, or at least before the wide adoption of economics. There was a lot of mercantilism going on at this time. A lot of really sort of poor decision making when it comes to the economy of countries in general. And it's a good thing that we've gotten away from that, Tony. We don't believe in, putting really heavy tariffs on imports or anything like that anymore. We've learned our lesson from Adam Smith. Unfortunately for France, their relief was relatively short-lived. When Napoleon came to power in the early 1800s, he reinstated the Gabelle. And at this time, he said, listen, we're not doing any of this high taxed areas and low taxed areas. Everybody pays the same. And because everybody paid the same, this sent the economies of the areas where there wasn't salt tax before into a massive tailspin. Those areas became ghetto-like, just sort of crummy places to live where people were living on potatoes and carrots and salt, and that was it. But eventually they did stop the tax in 1946 when France was liberated at the end of World War II. It lasted, I want to point this out. I mean, this is amazing to me. From 1259 to 1946.
So just shy of 800 years they had these Gabelle cops and everything.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure that there was a gradient. It wasn't always as bad as it was at its worst, but they were dealing with this stupid tax for that long before somebody finally realized it was a bad plan. And interestingly enough, Germany had a salt tax that was similar to this until 1996, although I don't think it was quite as unjust or perhaps as horrifically enforced at the time.
Also, I'm going to correct myself and say that's almost 700 years, not 800.
I've got my calculator watch on, Tony, but I did not do the math, so I just trusted you. That's it for this episode of Bad Ideas, though. I hope that you guys enjoyed learning about this. I thought this was fascinating. It was a really interesting read in the books that I read, and one of the books in particular was just called Salt, A History of the World. And it was interesting to see the French government sort of trying to push things down, and then they pop up in a different place, and you sort of try to tap that down, and then it pops up somewhere else, and this constant struggle of this really poorly thought out tax and trying to enforce it, and the incentives that they created for this for this smuggling to happen were really interesting. And I did not know about it until I started researching. Joe put this on the list, our boss. So he sent this one in, and we appreciate it. Thank you, Joe.
And if you guys have ideas to send us, send them to badideashow@gmail.com or tweet us at Human Echoes, and we'll see if they fit on the list. We're always looking for good new suggestions. And if you really like this, check out our Patreon, patreon.com/Human Echoes. It's a great way to support us there. Our personal Twitter handles are also at tsouthcott, TSOUTHCOTTE, and at Albert_Berg.
That's Berg like as in an iceberg. BERG. We'll see you guys next week. Thank you for watching or listening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Everybody.